This video reached you because you've been right longer than anyone admitted. Ever felt doubted while staying calm? Ever watched time slowly confirm what you already knew? This isn't about winning arguments. It's about moments aligning. Stay with me, because proof doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives undeniably. You knew before there was any proof, before results showed up, before anyone nodded in agreement. That certainty didn't come from confidence or ego, it came quietly, almost inconveniently. It showed up as a calm inner yes when everything outside you said, wait, not yet, or you're wrong. And carrying that kind of knowing isn't easy because it doesn't ask for permission and it doesn't explain itself. Being right early often feels lonely. You question yourself not because you lack faith, but because no one else can see what you see yet. You may have wondered why clarity came to you without a timeline, why the insight arrived without instructions. That's because this kind of knowing isn't meant to be debated, it's meant to be held. It asks for patience, not defense. Think about moments where you sensed how something would turn out, even when circumstances looked opposite. A relationship, a decision, a calling, or a truth about yourself. You didn't announce it. You carried it quietly. And while others reacted emotionally, you stayed steady, not because you were detached, but because you trusted what hadn't happened yet. This is where many people struggle. They assume being right should come with immediate validation, but some truths are assigned to people who can wait without becoming bitter, who can stay grounded without applause. That's not weakness, that's preparation. Certainty without confirmation builds inner strength that can't be shaken later. If this resonates, it's because you weren't meant to convince anyone. You were meant to remain aligned while time did the explaining. Being right early was never about proving others wrong. It was about learning to trust yourself before the world caught up. And that kind of trust becomes unshakable when proof finally arrives, because by then, you no longer need it. Being right didn't bring applause, it created distance. Not because you pushed people away, but because clarity naturally separates. When you start seeing things clearly, your priorities shift, your tolerance for confusion drops, and suddenly conversations that once felt normal feel misaligned. You didn't change to feel superior, you changed because growth quietly rearranged your inner world. Isolation often followed moments of truth. You may have noticed fewer messages, weaker support, or an unspoken gap between you and people who once felt close. That wasn't rejection, it was alignment correcting itself. Not everyone is meant to walk with you when your awareness expands. Some connections only survive shared confusion, not shared clarity. This kind of isolation is uncomfortable because it feels undeserved. You weren't cruel, you didn't abandon anyone, you simply stopped pretending, stopped shrinking your thoughts, stopped needing constant reassurance. And when that happens, distance forms without confrontation. Silence replaces noise, space replaces validation. There were times when you questioned if being right was worth the loneliness. You may have wondered why insight came with such a cost, but isolation wasn't meant to break you, it was meant to stabilize you. It removed external influence so your decisions could come from truth instead of pressure. Being alone sharpened your discernment. You learned to sit with your thoughts without rushing for distraction. You learned the difference between companionship and alignment. Most importantly, you learned that your peace doesn't depend on agreement. This phase wasn't about cutting people off. It was about learning who can stand beside you when you no longer doubt yourself. And once that lesson is integrated, isolation no longer feels like loss. It feels like clarity making room for what actually fits. People didn't question you because you were wrong. They questioned you because what you carried made them uncomfortable. When someone holds vision, it quietly exposes what others avoid seeing. Your words, choices, or even your silence reflected possibilities that required growth, and not everyone is ready for that. So doubt became their shield. You may have noticed how simple statements triggered resistance, or how your certainty was met with sarcasm, dismissal, or subtle discouragement. That wasn't about logic. It was about contrast. Vision creates contrast. It highlights stagnation without pointing fingers, and that alone can feel threatening to those who have settled. What made this harder is that you weren't trying to convince anyone. You weren't preaching or demanding agreement. You were simply moving according to what felt right. Yet even that was enough to provoke questions. When someone lives in alignment, it disrupts the comfort of those living on autopilot. Being questioned forced you to refine your awareness. You learned to speak less and observe more. You noticed who asked questions to understand and who asked to undermine. That discernment didn't come naturally, it came through experience. Each challenge trained you to trust your inner guidance instead of external approval. Vision doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as consistency, direction, and calm decision-making. And because it can't always be explained, it's often misunderstood. But misunderstanding doesn't cancel truth, it delays recognition. If you've been questioned repeatedly, it's not because your path is unclear. It's because your clarity highlighted the absence of direction in others. And that's something only time, not argument, can resolve. God allowed the doubt around you for a reason. If everyone had believed you immediately, you would have leaned on agreement instead of faith. Doubt stripped away external support so your trust could deepen internally. It forced you to stand without applause, without reassurance, and without confirmation, and that is where real strength forms. When people questioned you, it tested more than your patience. It tested whether you would shrink, over-explain, or abandon what you knew was right just to feel accepted. Many do. You didn't. You stayed steady even when being misunderstood felt unfair. That wasn't accidental. That restraint was being developed. Delayed validation teaches discipline. It trains you to move without needing permission. It shows you how to listen inwardly when outward voices grow loud. God wasn't withholding proof, He was building your capacity to handle it, because proof carries responsibility. Once it arrives, people watch more closely, expectations rise, influence expands. If confirmation had come early, it might have fed ego instead of alignment. Doubt kept you grounded. It kept your intentions clean. It ensured that when clarity finally becomes visible, it won't change you. You won't chase approval because you've already survived without it. This is why you weren't rescued from being questioned. You were refined through it. Faith that survives doubt becomes unshakable. And when proof arrives after that kind of testing, it doesn't inflate you, it settles you. What's ahead isn't about showing others they were wrong. It's about demonstrating that trust held quietly is stronger than belief borrowed from others. And that kind of trust never breaks when circumstances shift. Nothing moved for a long time, and that was the hardest part, not because you lacked effort, but because you were forced to wait without explanation. Silence surrounded your situation, no clear signs, no updates, no reassurance. It felt like being paused while everything else kept going, but that silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate. Silence tests emotional maturity. It reveals how you respond when there's nothing to react to. You couldn't argue with silence, you couldn't chase it, you couldn't control it. All you could do was remain steady, and that steadiness changed you. It taught you how to regulate doubt instead of feeding it. During that quiet stretch, you learned to stop checking for proof. You learned to stop asking when or why not yet. That shift mattered, because the moment you stop needing noise, you gain clarity. Silence strips away impulse and leaves only what's real. This phase also taught restraint. You realized that not everything needs to be explained in real time. Some things mature better without commentary. By staying quiet, you protected your direction from outside interference. You avoided reacting emotionally and creating outcomes that weren't aligned. Many people mistake silence for stagnation, but silence is often preparation. It creates space for inner alignment before outer movement. You weren't being delayed, you were being stabilized. Now, when movement begins, it won't feel rushed or chaotic. It will feel natural. Because silence trained you to recognize timing without panic. And once that skill is learned, nothing external can shake your sense of direction. You were asked to move forward without evidence. No guarantees, no visible signs, just an inner pull that didn't explain itself. That's not easy, especially when logic demands proof. But this wasn't about logic, it was about trust. Trusting what you sensed even when circumstances offered no support. There were moments when taking the next step felt unreasonable. Others waited for confirmation, but you were guided to act first. That separation mattered. Faith without evidence trains discernment. It teaches you how to listen inwardly when external data is incomplete. You likely questioned yourself quietly, not out of fear, but responsibility. You understood the weight of being wrong, yet something deeper kept you moving. That persistence wasn't stubbornness, it was alignment. When direction comes from within, it doesn't need consensus. Operating this way reshaped your confidence. You stopped borrowing certainty from opinions. You learned how to make decisions without constant validation. That skill changes everything. It builds self-trust that doesn't collapse when things slow down. Many people confuse faith with optimism. This wasn't optimism. This was commitment without comfort. You stayed present even when reassurance was absent. That's rare, and it's why this phase mattered. Now, when proof begins to appear, it won't surprise you. You've already learned how to stand without it. Evidence will simply confirm what you've been practicing all along, trusting yourself when there was nothing else to lean on. Being right wasn't the issue, being ready was. Clarity arrived early, but readiness had to catch up. There were emotional layers that needed strengthening, patience, restraint, humility. Without those, confirmation would have come too soon and changed you in ways that weren't aligned. You grew in ways no one could see. You learned how to stay calm under pressure. You learned how to wait without resentment. You learned how to hold certainty without needing to announce it. Those traits aren't automatic. They're developed through time and discomfort. There were moments when you felt capable but still held back. That wasn't contradiction, it was protection. Growth isn't just about knowing what's right, it's about being able to handle the weight of being right. Influence increases expectations, visibility tests integrity. You were being prepared for both. Maturity also meant releasing urgency. You stopped chasing outcomes. You started focusing on consistency. That shift mattered because rushed confirmation often creates unstable results. Readiness ensures stability. You didn't lose time during this phase. You gained depth. Depth that keeps you grounded when attention arrives. Depth that prevents arrogance when recognition follows. Depth that allows you to lead with steadiness instead of reaction. When proof finally shows itself, it won't overwhelm you. You've already done the internal work. And because of that, being right will feel natural, not dramatic. It will settle into place because you're prepared to carry it without losing yourself. While everything looked quiet on the surface, something important was happening out of sight. Your name, your character, your consistency, your intentions was being observed in moments where no one was applauding. Not publicly, not loudly, but privately. How you showed up when there was nothing to gain mattered more than any visible success. You were being tested in subtle ways. How you spoke when things didn't go your way. How you treated people who couldn't offer you anything. How you handled frustration without letting it harden you. These moments didn't feel significant at the time, but they were shaping how trustworthy your direction really was. Reputation isn't built when people are watching, it's built when they're not. Integrity forms in ordinary decisions, in how you respond to inconvenience, delay, or misunderstanding. You chose restraint over reaction. You chose consistency over attention. That choice carried weight, even if it felt unnoticed. There were opportunities to cut corners, to exaggerate, to seek validation in small ways. You didn't take them, not because you were perfect, but because something in you valued alignment over shortcuts. That restraint wasn't accidental, it was refining your credibility. When recognition arrives, it won't feel sudden to those who truly observed you. It will feel earned, because the version of you that remained steady in private is the same version that can be trusted in public. What's powerful about this phase is that it didn't rely on performance. It relied on who you were when nothing was happening. And that kind of proof can't be fabricated. It only forms through time, patience, and quiet consistency. As time passed, people began to fall away without explanation, not through arguments or dramatic endings, just distance. Messages slowed, support faded, familiar presence became absence. And while that loss felt confusing, it wasn't random, it was revealing. God wasn't removing people to punish you. He was allowing truth to sort itself out. When pressure increases, alignment becomes visible. Those who were only comfortable with your uncertainty couldn't stay once you became steady. Your growth made certain connections incompatible. You may have noticed who stayed quiet instead of supportive, who disappeared when patience was required, who only engaged when things felt light or convenient. That awareness wasn't meant to harden you, it was meant to clarify. Loyalty reveals itself when there's nothing to gain. This phase wasn't about judging anyone. It was about understanding who could walk beside you when progress was slow and outcomes were unseen. Some people were attached to versions of you that no longer existed. Others couldn't follow where your clarity was leading. What remained after the distancing mattered more than what left. The space created allowed for alignment, not loneliness. It protected you from carrying unnecessary weight into what's next. Now, as movement begins, your circle feels quieter but stronger, smaller but stable, because those who remain aren't watching for results, they're aligned with your direction. And that kind of presence doesn't waver when circumstances change topics. Your calm unsettled people more than any argument ever could. While others expected frustration, defensiveness, or emotional reactions, you stayed composed, not because you were unaffected, but because you understood that reacting would cost you clarity. That restraint confused those who were used to control through pressure. Calm is often misunderstood. People mistake it for indifference or weakness, but in reality, it takes strength to stay centered when misunderstood. You chose not to explain yourself repeatedly. You chose not to mirror chaos. That choice shifted the dynamic without you saying a word. When you didn't react, some tried harder to provoke one. Silence made them uneasy because it removed leverage. Without emotional access, influence disappears. And you didn't cut people off, you simply stopped engaging in cycles that drained you. Staying calm wasn't passive, it was intentional. You knew that reacting would pull you into situations that weren't aligned. You protected your direction by maintaining composure. That's authority without force. This phase taught you something important. Not every challenge requires response. Some situations resolve themselves when you don't interfere emotionally. Calm allows truth to surface naturally. Now your presence carries weight. People sense steadiness where there used to be tension, and that steadiness speaks louder than explanation ever could. Because when someone remains calm under pressure, it signals confidence that doesn't need to be announced. At some point, you stopped explaining yourself, not out of frustration, but clarity. You realized that the more you tried to justify your direction, the more power you gave to doubt that wasn't yours to carry. So you chose quiet confidence over constant defense. This shift didn't happen overnight. It came after being misunderstood repeatedly. After realizing that explanations didn't bring understanding, they invited debate. You learned that people who are meant to understand you don't need convincing, and those who aren't aligned won't be persuaded anyway. Letting go of explanation created freedom. You no longer felt responsible for managing others' opinions. You trusted your actions to speak over time. That trust eased internal pressure. It allowed you to move forward without checking for approval. Without explanation, your energy changed. Conversations became simpler. Boundaries became clearer. You stopped oversharing and started protecting what was still developing. That restraint wasn't secrecy, it was discernment. This phase also strengthened your self-respect. You recognized that clarity doesn't require validation. When you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your truth. Now, when people observe your progress, they connect the dots on their own. No narrative is needed, no justification required, because when alignment is real, it becomes visible without explanation. Truth doesn't hurry to be believed. It waits until it no longer needs defense. You may have felt pressure to rush outcomes, to show results quickly so doubt would stop, but rushing would have distorted what was forming. Some things need time to settle so they can stand on their own. You learn that forcing proof creates instability. When timing is rushed, outcomes crack under pressure. By waiting, you allowed your direction to strengthen without interference. Patience wasn't passive, it was strategic. It protected what was real from being tested too early. This phase trained you to release urgency. You stopped measuring progress by speed and started noticing consistency. That shift changed your perspective. You realized that what lasts doesn't need to arrive dramatically. It arrives when it's ready to hold weight. Truth matures quietly. It doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't panic when questioned. It stays intact until circumstances align naturally. And when that alignment happens, recognition feels inevitable rather than forced. Waiting taught you discernment. You learned when to act and when to stay still. That awareness can't be taught, it's earned through restraint. Most people move too soon and weaken their outcomes. You didn't. Now when movement happens, it won't feel rushed. It will feel settled, because truth that takes its time doesn't need to prove itself loudly. It simply stands and remains. God never asked you to persuade anyone. That pressure you felt, to explain, to convince, to justify, was never part of the assignment. Persuasion relies on words. What was being built in your life relies on outcomes, and outcomes don't need arguments. You slowly realized that convincing people drained your energy without changing their perspective. Some weren't listening to understand, they were listening to protect their assumptions. Once you saw that, you stopped trying to carry a burden that wasn't yours. You let go of the role of spokesperson and stayed focused on alignment. This shift brought relief. You no longer felt responsible for how others interpreted your path. You understood that clarity doesn't spread through debate, it spreads through consistency. When actions remain steady over time, they speak with authority no explanation can match. God handles credibility differently than people do. Instead of words, he uses timing. Instead of defense, he uses placement. Instead of persuasion, he allows situations to unfold until truth becomes visible on its own. That process can't be rushed or managed. By stepping back from convincing others, you protected your peace, you stayed grounded, you avoided unnecessary conflict, and most importantly, you preserved your direction. Now, as circumstances begin to align, understanding will come naturally to those who need it, not because you explained anything, but because reality did, and that kind of confirmation lasts because it wasn't forced. Even when people doubted you, they didn't stop watching. They observed quietly, often without saying a word, some out of curiosity, some out of comparison, some because they sensed something was unfolding and wanted to see how it would end. Their silence didn't mean disinterest, it meant attention without commitment. You may have felt unsupported, but you weren't unseen. Small changes in your consistency, your calm, your decisions were noticed. Not praised, not acknowledged, just noted. People tend to watch closely when they're unsure whether to believe or dismiss what they see, and that quiet observation carries weight. What's important is that you didn't perform for them. You didn't adjust your behavior to regain approval. You stayed steady even when you knew eyes were on you. That authenticity mattered more than approval ever could, because observers can sense when someone is acting and when someone is aligned. Some of those watching hoped you'd stumble, others quietly hoped you wouldn't. Either way, your persistence challenged their assumptions. Over time, doubt softened into reconsideration, not because you explained yourself, but because consistency kept showing up. Now, as things begin to shift, those same observers will connect the dots privately. There won't be public apologies or dramatic admissions, just a quiet recognition that you were steady when it mattered. And that recognition, even when unspoken, is powerful, because it confirms that truth doesn't need an audience, it only needs time to be seen. When proof arrives, it rarely announces itself. There's no dramatic moment, no grand reveal, no need for attention. Things simply begin to align in a way that can't be denied. Conversations change, circumstances shift, outcomes start reflecting what you've known all along. This is why you weren't meant to wait for a big moment. Proof shows up in patterns, not performances. It settles quietly, like something that was always meant to be there. And when it happens this way, it's harder for anyone to argue with it. You may notice that people respond differently without acknowledging why. The same ideas that were questioned before are now accepted. The same direction that seemed uncertain now feels obvious. Nothing is explained, it just becomes normal. This kind of confirmation is powerful because it doesn't invite debate. It doesn't need defense. It stands on its own. Reality adjusts, and people adjust with it. That's why timing mattered. Proof that arrives too loudly can be dismissed. Proof that arrives naturally becomes permanent. You didn't need to orchestrate this. You didn't need to prove anything. You just needed to stay aligned long enough for circumstances to catch up. And once they do, there's no need to point it out. The shift speaks for itself, because when proof comes without announcement, it doesn't fade, it stays. God proves you right in ways that don't require your involvement. You don't get a stage, you don't get a speech, you don't get to explain what happened. Life simply rearranges itself until the truth becomes obvious. And that's intentional because real confirmation doesn't need narration. You may notice outcomes speaking where words never could. Situations resolve in your favor without effort. Doors open without you asking. What once felt uncertain now feels settled. This kind of proof doesn't come from persuasion, it comes from positioning. You were placed where results could speak for you. What's powerful is that you don't feel the need to highlight it. There's no satisfaction in saying, "I told you so." The need for that disappears when alignment takes over. You're more focused on moving forward than looking back at who doubted you. This form of confirmation earns respect without confrontation. People sense the shift. They adjust their tone. They listen differently, not because you demanded recognition, but because reality left no room for doubt. God handles vindication quietly. That protects you from pride and keeps outcomes clean. You don't become hardened or defensive, you remain grounded. Proof doesn't change who you are because you didn't build your identity around being validated. And that's the point. When God proves you right, it's not to elevate ego, it's to establish stability. So when truth stands, it stands calmly, without explanation, without conflict, and without needing approval. The people who doubted you won't miss what's happening. They'll see it clearly, even if they don't comment on it. The same eyes that once questioned your direction will recognize the outcome as it unfolds, not dramatically, but undeniably. There's a quiet accountability in being witnessed by those who once dismissed you. You won't need to remind them of what they said. Memory does that on its own, and that awareness shifts how they engage with you moving forward. Tone changes, respect increases, distance softens. What's important is that you don't approach this moment with bitterness. You don't need closure from their acknowledgement. The fact that they see it is enough, because recognition doesn't always arrive as an apology, it often arrives as silence and recalibration. This moment also reveals growth in you. Earlier, you may have wanted validation. Now you don't need it. You're more focused on alignment than recognition. That inner shift matters more than external reaction. Those who once doubted are no longer obstacles. They become observers of a reality they didn't expect, and that's not your responsibility to manage. Letting people witness the outcome without commentary preserves your peace. It keeps the focus on what's unfolding, not what was misunderstood. And that quiet witnessing completes the cycle, without confrontation, without explanation, and without reopening old narratives. You reach this point without competing with anyone. No comparison, no race, no need to prove you were better or ahead. While others measured themselves against people, you stayed focused on alignment. That's why your progress feels different. It's stable, not reactive. You didn't win by outpacing others. You won by staying consistent when shortcuts were tempting. While competition creates anxiety, alignment creates peace. You learn that trying to outdo others pulls you off your path. Staying true to your direction kept your energy clean and your focus clear. This way of moving changed how you define success. It's no longer about being seen first or praised loudly. It's about outcomes that last. It's about inner calm that doesn't disappear when circumstances shift. That's a victory most people never experience. Because you didn't compete, you avoided resentment. You didn't carry the weight of comparison. You let others move at their pace while you honored your own timing. That restraint protected your clarity and prevented unnecessary conflict. Winning without competing also means there's no one to defeat, no score to settle, no rivalry to maintain, just progress that feels earned and peaceful. Now, as things align, the reward isn't external applause, it's inner certainty. You know you didn't force anything. You didn't step on anyone to get here. And that knowledge makes the outcome feel solid, grounded, and fully yours. This was never about being celebrated. It was about learning how to trust without needing recognition. Triumph looks loud from the outside, but trust grows quietly. What you were being shaped for required steadiness, not spotlight. Along the way, ego was stripped gently, not through loss, but through waiting. Waiting humbles without humiliating. It teaches you to release the need to be seen and focus on being aligned. That shift changed how you moved. You stopped chasing moments and started building consistency. This phase refined your intentions. You learned to act without expecting praise. You learned to hold confidence without broadcasting it. That balance matters because recognition can distort purpose if it arrives too early. Trust became the real achievement. Trust in timing, trust in your direction, trust that outcomes don't need constant attention to form. That kind of trust stabilizes everything that comes after. Because this wasn't about proving strength, it was about forming it, not about showing faith, but living it quietly. You didn't need affirmation to stay aligned, and that's what made this phase successful. Now, as confirmation unfolds, it doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels appropriate, because you're grounded in trust, not dependent on triumph. And that grounding ensures whatever comes next is carried with clarity, not pressure. This is the point where the discussion ends, not through confrontation, but through clarity. The questions that once followed you no longer apply. Circumstances have shifted enough to make doubt unnecessary. What once needed explanation now stands on its own. There's a sense of closure here, not emotional, but structural. The path feels locked in, decisions feel settled. You're no longer waiting for confirmation because life is moving forward without hesitation. That's how alignment completes itself. God doesn't argue, he concludes. And when he does, it's final, not dramatic, not loud, just evident. The outcome speaks in a way words never could. You may notice fewer opinions around you now, fewer challenges, fewer interruptions. That's because resistance fades when truth stabilizes. People sense when a chapter has closed and instinctively step back. What matters most is how this feels inside you. Calm, certain, resolved. You're not celebrating, you're continuing, and that's the sign of completion. There's nothing left to defend, nothing left to wait for. The argument has ended because the result has arrived. And from here, movement continues without resistance, steady, grounded, and clear. As this message comes to a close, remember this: you were never imagining it. What you sensed, what you held onto quietly, and what you trusted without proof is now aligning in real time. The season of questioning is giving way to clarity, and the weight you carried alone is beginning to lift. You don't need to rush, explain, or look back. What's unfolding is steady, earned, and meant to last. If this resonated with you, take a moment to ground yourself in that truth. Let it settle. Growth doesn't always feel loud, but it is always meaningful. You're stepping into a phase where confidence replaces doubt and direction feels natural again. This is Wisdom's sign, and if this message spoke to you, support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing for more guidance like this. I'd also love to hear from you. Comment below what stood out most or where you're noticing alignment in your life. Your insight matters, and your path is just getting clearer.